President Metsola, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me here. Thank you.
It's been a long week. It's Wednesday, but it feels like UNGA, everything is packed. Now we're going to talk about Europe. We'll put the spotlight on defense, on, of course, the priorities for the European Union, some of the things that are going on. But you were at the UN yesterday, listening to President Trump and that speech where he talked a lot about Europe. What were you thinking?
Well, my first thought is that because I host and chair quite a lot of meetings like that, is that I hope that if I had to do that, the teleprompters would work for a guest like
Number one.
Secondly was that it's refreshing not to have so much scripted speeches, because I think conversations where you can explain your thoughts are so much better received, whether you agree with them or not. I would focus on two takeaways from yesterday's speech. First of all, it's defense and energy, because those are directly linked to how we as a continent have evolved over the last years, but also where we can still do much more. First of all, on defense. Russia's invasion of Ukraine brought us up to a very brutal reality, to the fact that we were not prepared. We were overly dependent. Our allies were not, let's say, convinced that we could be as united as in fact we were. Since then, defense expenditure has shot up, investment, and also investment in our own capacities to defend our own. Secondly, on energy, we were almost completely reliant on Russian gas. We continue to work towards a complete uncoupling, finding alternative sources, not letting go of our ambitions, but understanding that it's always better to be dependent on allies than on non-reliable neighbors, no matter how much closer they are. And I think those calls by the current US administration, by President Trump, and also an understanding by our leaders, our prime ministers, heads of state, in saying, you know what, maybe we have not done enough. We've been pushing forward or delaying things that we should have done decades or years ago, are now being pushed into action. And I would take that as a win, but also as an objective for us to reach, while being extremely proud of how we do things, but also understanding where we could do things better.
President, when you look at defense spending, it's a huge game changer for Europe. What do you say to those that worry, actually, that there's too much defense spending focus, which takes away, focus on climate change or nature financing?
Well, this is a real debate that's happening in different member states, different countries, members of the European Union. There are some that have a tradition of spending much more on defense, some that have for many years not spent, even though they should have. And I think there is a common understanding that there is a need to step up, whether you are a country that has an eastern flank with an unreliable neighbor, or a country that has long forgotten how to beef up its military capacity, its armies, its navies. And that's a conversation that we needed to have. The timing, I guess, was done. I mean, we had to have it this summer. Whether it should have been prompted earlier is a question that we should ask ourselves, and not anyone else, in a way, should answer for us. But it is one that is a cold reality, but an understanding. Now, where does the money come from? We're talking about how to make a continent that should be much more competitive, that should be much more open for business, that should make it much easier for people to grow, to scale up, to invest, that our AI graduates stay in Europe and actually continue to showcase the best we have, the best talent we have on our continent, that our universities continue to grow. How do you make sure that education and health remain free? This is a big debate in the European Union and one that is non-negotiable. So we see it more as an incentive to grow our economies, even because you invest in defense, even because you invest in companies that help you grow your defense capacity in order to compensate for the lack of competitiveness. It is not we take money away from there in order to invest in another area. It's where, what's the waste? How much money do we waste between one country and another because of regulatory burdens, things we are scaling back right now because of the necessity to do that? Two, how do we make sure that we invest in most higher standards in education and health, while giving our citizens comfort that's all our, we're elected politicians, and I look back to last year's election, which sent a very clear message to us that citizens want their life to be fairer, they want it to be safer, they want it to be ultimately easier. If we can't deliver on that by making them safer, also easier and fairer with a job and a roof over their head, then we would not be doing our job well.
But has Europe done enough to be more competitive?
No. Europe has to do much, much more.
Why not?
I think for many years, and I think we felt a lull of security, a lull of, I would say from political perspective, our voters would always vote for us to remain in office, etc. That is not the case. This is an appeal, a plea from our citizens that we're not taking their concerns seriously. We went far too fast in imposing regulatory burdens, which were noble in cause, but absolutely the opposite and unfeasible in their rollout. We find ourselves with so many barriers between trying to move capital from one country to another, that when we look over, and I spend a lot of time here in the United States and also speaking to investors who want to invest in what for them is the largest growing market and a very open market for them, but with impossibility to operate because of burdens between one country and another. So I think we have, I would say finally, especially because the political landscape has changed, recognized that we went too far too fast. However, but we managed to overcome previously impossible things. So during the pandemic, we realized that we needed to become much more efficient, much more streamlined. Solidarity needed to be shown. Since the Russian invasion, we realized that the so-called energy union that we thought we would have did not exist at all. We realized that our defense union was being stalled by completely different standards for military, for example, defense equipment between one country and another. If you compare, in the US, you have around 30 types of different weaponry. In the European Union, we have different licensing that add up to 75. How are we going to be competitive? And how are we going to make sure that we present ourselves as a good market and as somewhere that you can invest in? And that's something we're asking ourselves. In a month from now, we are going to be adopting legislation that will significantly ease the burden, and we will be open to say that we're open for business, perhaps a little bit more open than we were before.
And are politicians fully on board with that across the European Union? Have they taken, we're 1 year on from actually the Draghi report?
Yeah, I think we have no choice. Is there differences of opinion? Of course. I run a parliament and I chair it, one of 720 colleagues from 27 different countries, from 8 different political groups. And these are groups that have, of course, different ideas about how to get there. But when I said before that our citizens, people who elected us, people who we represent, even those who did not vote for us, told us, make our lives, please, simpler, make it easier and make it safer, that is not so much to ask. And if you tell any of my colleagues as to whether they can deliver that, I think the answer would be a resounding yes.
President, let me talk to you about the trade deal, on the EU-US trade deal. I mean, given the EU has held a trade power with the US for a long time, I mean, there's been so much criticism for the 15%. Is Europe's better time used to actually try and focus domestically rather than squabble over the 15%?
Yeah, we squabble quite a lot. We also tend to undersell results. We do things differently, and I think that we could learn a lesson or two as to how we have really managed successfully, not only in making sure that we have a trade relationship that can work with the United States, which is by far our large trading partner, and this goes both ways, but also in seeing how we can go faster in adopting trade deals with different parts of the world. It cannot take between 10 to 25 years for a trade deal to come into force. And that's a reality. It's not just a number I just pulled out of a hat. That's how long it has taken for the negotiations for Mercosur. That's how long it continues to take to make sure that our trade deal, for example, with Canada is fully implemented, even though it's about 97% there. Same goes for Australia and New Zealand, but big success with India, for example. So, of course, we would like to have zero tariffs. If you ask me what would have been perfect, is that there would be no tariffs between our continent and the United States. We are the world's largest trading partners. Our consumers depend on the US, and the US consumers also depend very largely on our products. If you see today what is tariffed and what is not, the number tips very much favorably over what is not tariffed. So I think, besides squabbling as to whether this was a good deal or not, and of course it will be scrutinized closely in the Parliament, because that's our role, that will come to us by the end of the year, but it also an understanding that our businesses, our investors, our companies on both sides of the Atlantic need predictability, that market volatility is bad for everyone, that we need to see how we can invest better, how we can be smoother, how we can make sure that we don't lose capital across the Atlantic, but perhaps keep it in order to invest and grow. So I'd turn it around and say, yes, we squabble, but at the end of the day, we have also tended to undersell our successes. We just need to get better at doing that.
Do you think the Parliament will give its blessing to the trade deal?
Well, I can't preempt what my colleagues will do. There is, of course, different viewpoints. Some would say that we need to see amendments. Some would say, that this is, better than we could have had. Or some would say this is worse than we should have had. And then it comes to numbers. But I'm fairly optimistic that we will have an agreement without preempting what the outcome will be.
President, we have a lot of chief executives. So what do you think the role for the private sector is in the EU achieving its goals?
Well, it is the same as our role of succeeding in delivering on what our responsibilities are. If today we are being asked to make things easier for you to operate in the European Union, then that's our job to do so, because that translates into slowing the loss of jobs. We have seen a big loss, for example, in the automotive sector. Questions that we are asking: how will our pharmaceutical industries continue to thrive? That if the semiconductor industry is dependent on European products, that continues to be the case. That if we are going to completely reinvent our energy diversification, that we also rope in the United States in making sure we manage that. And that was also part of the big discussion that we had also with the United States administration, that I have with my colleagues in Congress, as I have, let's say, you can see a lot of alignment there. So I would say we're dependable, we're boring sometimes, but we're also predictable. And I think that perhaps better than before, where we would like to say, we spent a lot of time saying, we're the best, you should do it like us, or, listen to us, we know better. I think the time for that is over. That parochial attitude did not help, but rather, where we went too fast, we should analyze. Where we went too far, we need to be honest. And it's this sense of honesty that those who place me in my position of responsibility, my voters, would like to see. That sense of, maybe we could have done that better. Or with us, that we're going to take a course of what is value-based, moral clarity, but with an understanding of what is needed for our continent to go forward. We'll never be apologetic for the way we do things, but it is an understanding that our citizens are appealing for us to be better. And being better is always a goal.
I don't know whether to be outraged or excited that some people think Europeans are boring. But I imagine
you're as a fellow European, right? You can, but you're Italian.
There's always something going on with the Italians.
We're in Mediterranean. I think we can sort of call ourselves a little bit more exciting. Yeah,
I 100% agree.
I think
we can say that. President, when you speak to investors, do they bring up regulation, or do they bring up something else, like security? I want to ask about Ukraine as well. But what's the number?
I like to think. I tend to count. as to when the word regulation comes up. As soon as a CEO walks into my office, it's usually within like the third or fourth sentence after hello. I think it's an understandable request for them to be able to understand why we have tens of thousands of pages of legislation every mandate, whereas there's less than a fraction of that in the US, where we have acronyms that are completely ununderstandable, where an election is run on what does CSDDD mean, but one where I can be proud to say that in a couple of weeks we will vote, yes, it will take over 1,000 amendments that I need to chair over, is that we will significantly reduce burdens for companies that have been asking us to do so, for them to be able to do business with us, for them to be able to keep opening factories in the European Union, for manufacturing to continue to grow, for jobs, especially in underserved areas, to regain traction. You know, you see countries that joined the European Union the last 20 years that have done amazing things in terms of economic growth. The last thing we would need is to see backsliding because of our own fault. You know, we can blame externalities and say this is not us, but, you know, time for that is over. And if we are able to say, look, here we could do better, and that's what we will manage to show. A couple of hours ago, we voted on huge simplification for the agriculture industry. We have been asked for this for years. And we as a parliament have said we need a legislative proposal to push it through. We managed to do it in a matter of weeks. So when the political will is there, and mark my words, it is, we will deliver.
President, just a final question actually on Ukraine. I think you've just come back from Ukraine, from Kyiv.
On Thursday, yeah.
I mean, do you believe that Ukraine could join the EU by 2030, like some have suggested?
Yeah, I think our principle has to be is that enlargement is a win-win. I was involved in the negotiations of my country's entry into the European Union. It took over a decade, and I cannot begin to imagine what the Ukrainians are doing under bombs that are falling, as I saw myself every day in Kiev and in the larger cities. What I would like to see is a commitment on behalf of our continent, where if you see speed being shown by a country to join the European Union, a club that is not just an economic club, but a political one, that is not about charity, but strategically wise to do so, then our doors should be flung wide open. I've just come from a meeting with all the leaders of the Western Balkan countries, and that's exactly the message I gave to them. That if a country has completed all the technical steps, and it's merit-based, and it needs those technical steps to be achieved, how can we look at them in the eye and tell them, wait, not now? I myself can't do that. And that's a commitment that you asked me before, will there be majorities? There's a huge majority in the European Parliament precisely for that. And in Ukraine, I must also say, maybe tying it to the first point we had, is that I'm very encouraged by the discussions between President Trump and President Zelensky yesterday. I think that after many months, we could see that there is a full alignment as to where Europe and the United States stand on this issue. It's taken us a while to get there, but I would say, as someone who has been there last week, and the sense of fatigue, but inspiration that the Ukrainians give us, this is a few hours away from my own house, that they are fighting for our security, and that if we don't recognize that, then where are we as leaders in the world of recognizing responsibility that is on our shoulders?
President Metsola, thank you so much for joining us.
Is that a time is up, or?
No, I think it was an applause for you. Thank you. Thank you for joining us.